Mind the gap, as they say in London on the tube. Mind the gap. Distances, gaps. Distances between people and places and ideas. In our tales from Scripture today, there are lots of distances, lots of separation between the people and the places. Jesus is said to be walking in the region between Samaria and Galilee, but these two regions actually border each other. There isn't a region between them. So is Luke's geography just a bit useless? Or does Luke mean that Jesus is in the no man's land between the two regions and between the two peoples who hated each other, Samaria and Galilee? Is it like a no man's land between the trenches in World War I, or on either side of the wall between Israel and Palestine now? It creates a sense of distance between those people. And then we're told 10 lepers approach, and they keep their distance as required by law. They weren't allowed to approach others in case they infected them. And Jesus does not approach them either. He simply tells them to go and show themselves to the priests, meaning they have to go and be certified by the priests as having been healed so that they can re-enter the community. And the distance is going to remain until they have done that. Luke's audience for this story would have immediately leapt in their minds to the wonderful story we just heard from the Book of Kings. Naaman, the Syrian general, who also had leprosy. He, however, seems to be allowed to function in his family and in society, but he has in his household a slave girl. We don't know her name. She's from Israel. She was captured in battle. And she should have every reason to hate her master and keep her distance. But she chooses to intervene and suggests Naaman go and seek healing from the great prophet Elisha. Now, this requires letters of request and safe passage from the king of Aram, which is modern-day Syria, and he writes a letter to the king of Israel. The king of Israel suspects a trap and wants to stay away from this problem, but Elisha intervenes and asks for Naaman to be allowed to come. Elisha too keeps his distance. He doesn't meet with Naaman with all his retinue and all his gifts, but issues instructions for him to go and wash in the Jordan. Now, Naaman doesn't want to come off his high horse, literally, and he expects a much bigger show of magic from the prophet, but convinced in the end by his servants, who were a class of people distant from him, he's convinced by them and he washes, and he's made clean. So in both these stories, people have the barriers up. Barriers of class, barriers of race, barriers of expectation. And they have physical distance of geography, but they also have distance engendered by fear of disease and fear of each other. They don't want to go anywhere near each other. In Naaman's story, the people who bridge the divide, who bridge the gap, who reach out to close the distance, they are the unnamed slave girl, Elisha the prophet, and the servants. If the girl had not urged her mistress to urge Naaman to try and get to Elisha, nothing would have happened. And if the servants had not urged Naaman to swallow his pride and get in the River Jordan, nothing would have happened. In the story of Jesus and the 10 lepers, the distance between the lepers and Jesus and the lepers and the rest of the people is maintained until the middle of the story, when the story shifts and one of the lepers returns. So we've had the distance between Samaria and Galilee, and we've had the distance of those people separated by their hatred, and we've had the lepers standing away from the community, and we have Jesus sending them to the priests, healed, but with no sense of interaction or compassion really. And then suddenly the story pivots and the distance collapses. One of them, we are told, turned back. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Ah, the listeners to the story say, isn't that lovely? One of them came back. But then we're told he was a Samaritan. What? No, the barriers go up again. A leper and a Samaritan. He is the one. Where are the others? Jesus asks. Jesus says, is only the foreigner here? And I wonder, does he say foreigner with a disparaging tone? Is only the foreigner here? Or a welcoming one? Only the foreigner is here. And then that gap is closed. The barriers are down. And Jesus says, get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well, which probably translates better as your faith has made you whole. All of the 10 were healed, but the one who came back is the one who is made whole. One reached out with gratitude and thankfulness. The Samaritan, the foreigner, he returns with gratitude. The Samaritans, who were the ones expected to be dishonest or dangerous, and certainly disliked, if not hated, by the people of Israel, the Samaritan returns to give thanks. To give thanks for healing, for clean skin, for freedom, for the release from being an outcast. Gratitude for being able to re-enter society, gratitude for a new future, new possibilities. And knowing all these things were very much beyond his control, but in the hands of God, he comes back to give thanks. And it's the sense of thankfulness which bridges that gap. Gratitude closes the gap between Samaritan and Jew, between outcast and rabbi. Gratitude reaches across that distance, reaches across the divide. Distance, gaps, mind the gap. In a city like ours, we walk and drive past hundreds, if not thousands, of strangers every day. Do you remember that great scene from the old movie Crocodile Dundee, when Australian Dundee tries to shake hands with all the passers-by in New York as if he'll see them all again? From outback Australia to New York, people think he's crazy trying to say hello to everyone. We live with that distance every day. We can't know all our neighbours in the city, but we also allow the pressures of life and the rush of the city, the traffic, to create distance between us. Living in an apartment can be the loneliest way of living, even with other people through the wall right next to you. Hirini Carr spoke last week of the racial divide that can be made worse by the politics of someone like Donald Trump or our own Don Brash and his new group. We need leaders who break down the walls that divide, not build them up. On the worldwide scene, the calamity that is Syria stems from multiple divisions and hatred. Our story from the Book of Kings today begins in the region of Aram, which is part of modern-day Syria and is the region where Aleppo is today. Aleppo, so much in the news. So division and hatred and distance still haunt the people thousands of years later in Aram. And we watching from afar feel completely powerless to do anything except lament and say, God, how long? Yet when we gather each week to worship, we take a stand against distance and division, and we do close the gap. Because we gather with strangers, we gather with people of many cultures, people of many social groupings, walks of life. As Archbishop Tutu once said, God's rainbow people. We gather with everyone. And what is it that we do together? We give thanks. Giving thanks is the central act of our worship, the Eucharist, means to give thanks. And we call that particular part of the service the Great Thanksgiving. When the Samaritan leper returns to Jesus and we're told he prostrates himself at Jesus' feet and thanks him, the word for thanks in Greek is eucharisteo, the same word that Jesus uses when giving thanks at the Last Supper over the bread and wine. We've made Eucharist into a special kind of holy word, but it simply means to give thanks. When we offer our gifts of bread and wine at the Eucharist, we are giving thanks for the gifts of God in our lives and expressing our faith in God for the future. And our act of giving thanks, as Jesus did, brings us close to God and close to each other. Our act of giving thanks is what can make us whole. Our act of giving thanks closes the gaps, shortens the distances, and brings down the walls. It's quite radical, really. Where else in our society in 2016 do we get to hang out with all sorts of people who we would not otherwise meet? A school, maybe? A sports club, a community group? Maybe. But I would argue that those groups are more homogenous than church, especially a church like ours in the heart of the city. But before we congratulate ourselves too much and start to feel cosy, remember what Jesus says to the leper who returns: get up and go on your way. He can't stay and hang out with Jesus. He has to go and get on with his life. And so it is with us. We gather, we give thanks, we experience community, closing the gaps and the distance between us, and then we are sent out to be God's people in the world, to find new places to give thanks and close gaps, modelling ourselves on the pattern that we learn here in our liturgy. Mind the gap. Get up and go on your way, for your faith has made you whole.